Everybody.
What's up?
Hi, Austin. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. So my name is Ryan Thompson. I teach in the art and design department here at Trinity, and I also am the acting gallery director for the Seerveld Gallery at the end of the hall, which we'll visit in a few minutes. So we have about 6 shows every year, and every 2 years we show some faculty work, and this happens to be that show this evening, which you're in the right place. I hope. I don't know. We'll see about that. That's for you to decide. We can talk about that later. So we're all going to talk briefly about our work for no more than about 20 minutes. I'm looking at you, Baker. So Professor Baker's going to start. Ellen Browning's going to go second, and I'm going to go last. Alphabetical order, for whatever that's worth. Instead of drawing straws, I suppose. So I'm going to introduce John Baker by saying that he went to Calvin College and then to Michigan State. Yes, I didn't want to say. If you say university, it's like a brawl breaks out in the right part of the country. Maybe not this part, but it's Michigan State. And he has a number of pieces in the City of Chicago art collection. At some different public buildings in the city. You can ask him about those. And he was represented by Marion Dessen Gallery in the city, which was a really big and well-known gallery for a long time. And he is still making really wonderful paintings, so we're glad to have him. Thanks, John.
Hi. So my dad, I'm going to give you a little bit of background first so that you can kind of see why I do what I do. My dad was a pretty successful businessman in Pella, a little town in central Iowa. And in his mid-40s, he decided that he wanted to leave his business and a seat on the city council and go into the ministry. And what that meant was, at my house, the local religious radio station was on starting about 6 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock every night. And my parents, because they were passionate about theology, sort of gave a running critique about whose ideas they agreed with and whose they didn't agree with quite so much and whose they thought were just really, really not right. And that kind of analysis is called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the discipline of figuring out how we interpret stuff. For example, on Monday I was with 3 other professors and 4 students, a little seminar that we have in the BBC, which is the snack shop across the creek, and passionate discussion. In the middle of the discussion, I stood up and said, I want to get a knife. And everybody sort of stopped and their eyes went wide. And I said, well, I have this blueberry cupcake, and I just want to cut it in 8 pieces so that I can share it with you. So here's, the same action from, they thought of it as hostile, I thought of it as generous. And we're in that situation all the time. And you guys say to your mom says to you, oh, hi, honey, what did you do Friday night? Nothing. And who do you do all that nothing with? Nobody. Just my friends, right? And, or if your brother does something and you get in trouble for it, you know the whole score, but your mom doesn't see everything, although sometimes she thinks she does. At least my mom did. Pearl, may she rest in peace. She's a great lady. So the stuff that I've been really passionate about for probably the last 30 years is the idea of interpretation and creating images that put the viewer on a kind of knife's edge to decide one way or the other. So I'm calling this Holding It Together, Part 1, Hermeneutics. A little bit of background. I want you to understand how I came to use all these sort of fragmented panels. That That's my house. I bought it before I was married. I bought it because of that wall right there. It's 9 feet tall, 16 and a half feet wide, and that was my studio because I wasn't married. And I did really big paintings. I did this painting. It was too big to get out the door. It folds up. It's a real pain. And that's how my wife and I spent my courtship, was moving this painting around. So I decided that I would paint on multiple panels. And I hated it when artists would just do a big painting and have a line running down the middle of it. So I decided that since my work dealt with the Greek notion of the ideal, that I would pick a shape that referenced the ideal. So I think here's this piece. It's another piece of Greek sculpture. This is like late 80s. There's this thing called the golden rectangle. It goes like this. So take a square, you add another square to it, and then you add a square that's 2 times that square, right? Then the next one you add is 3 wide. And of course, you put one across the top, it would be 5 wide. And then it would be 8 wide, and then it would be et cetera, et cetera. So here's a painting that's based on that. And I can get it out the door, sort of, because the piece on the right is like 7.5 feet square, and I still can't get that out the door. But okay, so a little history lesson. That's kind of, just so you know, I started breaking stuff up because I couldn't get stuff out the door. Right? So the next piece was, I gradually started to realize that in the art world, that had a very particular kind of meaning. If you go back 1,000 years to this image, this is a Last Judgment at the Saint-Lazare Cathedral in Autun, France. And of course, the central figure is Christ. And 1,000 years ago, that was the gaze that controlled all of culture. Oops. That was the gaze that controlled all of culture. Everything was related to God. When you get to the Renaissance and people invent perspective, what happens is man replaces God, because the entire universe is arrayed from the point of view of a single individual. This is Albrecht Dürer's drawing machine from almost exactly 500 years ago. And what you see, all of you have done this if you're an artist, you look on the table, you see that grid? Every one of you has gridded out a piece of paper, and you put a grid on what you were drawing, then you transferred the image. Well, what he's doing is he's looking through that like window frame with a grid in it. I make my drawing students and painting students do the same thing. I print out a little grid on acetate, and they hold it up. It's exactly the same thing, all right? And what that does is the entire drawing is arrayed from the point of view of that single individual. Now, that kind of unified point of view lasted for a while, long time. And when you look at this rectangle, the rectangle is another ideal shape. It functions like a window, right? And if you put a frame around anything, it creates this sort of virtual space, and anything can happen in that space. And it's unified. Well, about the 1880s, 1890s, that kind of unity started to fall apart. This is the work of an artist named Paul Cézanne. And one way to think about what Cézanne did is to think about the way your eye moves. It's called saccadic movement. If you've seen charts of eye movements, they're like these little jittery things, right? And so when your eye stops, and that's when you see, and then it moves, and you see something else, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, just like you're doing right now. And your brain puts that all together in a kind of unified image. And what Cézanne did was slow that process down so that what you see are those individual little chunk, 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 chunk. Here's an easier one to see it in. It's a little more obvious. So what I want you to do is I want you to look at the back corner, right up there. And he does that chunk. And then if you look to the left of the bowl and you look at the edge on the table, see the way it drops just a little bit? And then you go to the basket, the other side of the basket, and it's down a whole bunch. If you did that in my class, I would give you a B-. All right? And what's starting to happen is this unified image is starting to break up, and Here's the guy who really kicks it down the roadways. This is Pablo Picasso. And what Picasso does is he looks at every part of the figure. In fact, you can see in this figure, one eye is in profile, one eye is frontal. It's all this kind of jumble. And what Picasso is doing is trying to give you all 6 sides of the object simultaneously. But it's this very, very fragmented image. Of course, it's held together by that ideal rectangle. Okay, so fast forward 70 years to the mid-'80s. And here's this very witty reference. By the way, the white on this is the wall. It's not the painting, it's the wall. So it's this very witty reference to the idealized rectangle of the frame. And when you look at this image, what holds it together is that pristine geometric egg shape. So it's the image that's holding the thing together, not the structure of the canvas. In other words, the artist is projecting this image onto this fragmented canvas to try to create a whole. Here's another example, a somewhat more exuberant example. This is the work of Elizabeth Murray, who worked here in Chicago. And if you look carefully, what you can see is this kind of circular shape. And then these things sticking out. It's actually this sort of wacky table and this green and blue patterned tablecloth floating above it like a parachute. And once again, it's the image of the painting that holds the structure together. And for me, that's a kind of projection. It's about how we project order onto the world. I'll talk about that in a little bit more. But now back to the golden section. You know, I painted all this stuff on the golden section. I'd been very, very careful, like to the 1/4 of an inch, to make sure that the proportions were exactly right. And then I started to think, why would I protect that ideal? Because what I think is true is that all of us have an ideal, right? Our high school guests tonight have this ideal that they are going to pick the perfect college and they are going to hit it out of the park, land this great job, right? All of us have that ideal, right? And then, of course, reality sets in and, well, you get a pretty good job but not the perfect job. Or school doesn't go quite the way you thought it was. You thought you were going to be a brilliant painter and instead you came out of a brilliant designer, all right? Or vice versa. So I started to deform the golden section. These paintings are really teeny. They're about this big. That's about 5 by 7 or 8. Here's another just as an example. All right? Okay, a little more history to bring it up to date to the work that's in the gallery. There's a tradition of painting in the Renaissance. You have to remember that in the Renaissance, there's people are not literate. So the reason that the church commissions image after image after image by the acre is the paintings told the story of the Bible. It was the way you taught your kids what the stories in the Bible were. So there are all these stories about what happens in the Bible. And one story in particular was sort of on my mind a couple of summers ago. There's a story, it's in Matthew, about the wise men who come to see, they come looking for Jesus. And of course they go to Jerusalem because that's the capital of the country. And they talk to Herod the king. They say, hey, we just heard a new king's been born. Can you help us figure out where he is? And it turns out that he's in Bethlehem. And Herod, of course, isn't interested in competition. And he tells the wise men, he says, tell me when you find him, because I'll come give him gifts too. And of course, Herod isn't genuine with respect to that, and the wise men figure that out. They don't go back to talk to Herod. Herod finally figures out that they're not coming back, and he sends his soldiers to Bethlehem, and they kill every boy, baby, 2 and under. So this is an image called the slaughter of the innocents. Well, the reason I was thinking about the slaughter of the innocents is because over the last 10 years, since 9/11, all of us have been thinking about terrorism and our country's response to terrorism and what we call, collateral damage. And I decided that I wanted to do some painting about that. And as I was thinking about this event happened. This is the island of Utoya in Denmark. You can see it was a summer camp for the local political party. It was the left of center party, and they stood for a kind of open inclusion policy, which meant that immigrants could come to Denmark and the like. And there was a guy named Anders Behring Breivik, who was a white supremacist, who thought his idea of perfection, as opposed to the liberal democratic idea of perfection that included everybody, his idea of perfection was Denmark was for the Danes. It should be kept pure. So this is an image that I painted. It's from a news photograph. It's this idyllic island. It is just the essence of paradise. And of course, the liberal Democrats were trying to construct paradise. And so was Anders Behring Breivik. He was trying to create his own kind of paradise. So for me, these fractured panels have a couple of functions. One function is it's a sort of quiet way to talk about the devastation and the fragmentation that happened to all those families there. It's a hard painting for me to paint because my kids are this age. On the other hand, the fragmented panels are also about our own fragmented understanding, just like your mom's, right? All of us have a fragmented understanding of the world, and we've tried to put it together, and there are always gaps. And for me, this is a kind of prayer for humility. Here's another image that I use in the show. This is November 26, 2008 in Mumbai, in India. 26/11 in India is like our 9/11. A bunch of Pakistani terrorists came down, and the building you see on your right is the Taj Palace Hotel. They took over the hotel. And this is a news photo from the just very beginning of the event, from what I can tell. And the pigeons are the point of the image because they are all getting startled by the gunfire that's just starting to happen. And you can see the people looking over the wall haven't quite gotten what's going on yet. That's the painting. And then this is Guantanamo Bay. Because it's really easy for us to think, well, those are the bad guys. We're clean, pure. And I have some deep reservations about Guantanamo Bay. Not everybody shares those. I was talking about this with a friend of mine, and he said, oh yeah, my kid's a mechanic on an F-15. I thought, oh, this is going to be an interesting conversation. And then one of the Marines who works here, if you go down where all the rocks are, that's called Girl Scout Beach. And I want you to pay particular attention to, I think it's that rock and that rock. He went down and he took a photograph, and I based this painting on that photograph. And that's it. All my stuff is about that kind of contest of interpretation. So next up is Ellen Browning. Ellen Browning went to Indiana University, did her graduate work at the School of the Art Institute. While she was there, she did design work for the Goodman Theater. And after she graduated, she did work for AT&T, for Owens Corning, Kraft Foods, had a piece in the print annual, which is like sort of the All-Star game every year for the art and design world. Please welcome Ellen Browning.
Welcome. I'm going to switch gears a little bit tonight. My background is, as John mentioned, in corporate design. However, the work I'm showing you tonight is done in wood type. And so I want to give you a little bit of background about wood type. Not a lot of people are familiar with it. And also how I got involved in working with wood type. Wood has been used for letter forms and illustrations dating back to the first known Chinese print, woodblock print, from around 868 AD. The forerunner of the block print in China was the wooden stamp. Images on these small stamps were most often that of Buddha or sometimes some other Chinese characters. These stamps are really not unlike the modern-day rubber stamps that we use today. Early in Europe, large letters were used in printing and were carved out of hardwood because the metal type at the time had a tendency to develop uneven surfaces or cracked as it cooled. In America, during the mid-1700s through the mid-1800s, with the Industrial Revolution, came the expansion of commercial printing. It was inevitable that someone would perfect a process for cheaply producing large letters so in demand for the broadsides of the time, which were large posters, announcements for events or proclamations. Maple hardwood was the logical material for wood type because of its lightness, availability, and known printing qualities. When people see the wood type posters, they often remember the classic wanted poster. That's really what we're the most familiar with when we think of wood type. This particular poster was created by the United States War Department and issued in 1965 in search of the person who shot President Lincoln. But really, wood type is a part of our nation's graphic history, helping people communicate the sale of horses or land, political rallies, booklets, packaging, or even circus posters such as this poster and a detail from it. Wood type helped express the messages of the day. My introduction to wood type was a little-known documentary film called Typeface by a filmmaker, Justine Nagin, about the Hamilton Type Museum and Printing Museum in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. I viewed this film one weekend downtown in Chicago at the Gene Siskel Film Center about 4 years ago. The film chronicles the preservation and renewed interest in handset type at one of America's great wood type printing companies. Hamilton has a long history as far as wood type is concerned and is one of the originators of wood type production. In the film, old-timers who used to work at Hamilton mix with graphic design students from Chicago who travel 175 miles north to Two Rivers to participate in workshops and use the museum's working presses. The museum has come a long way since that film. The film is a fascinating look at an analog process once thought long dead that has been rediscovered by many in the digital age who have never known it before. There have been many comparisons made between the Industrial Revolution and what we are experiencing now, what many in the field are referring to as the digital revolution, with digital technology evolving at an exponential rate. And here you see imagery of the digital revolution, technological images, very technologically based and designed. These are the original icons for the Macintosh computer, designed in 1983 by Susan Kare, and they're pixel-based, all right? Much different than the icons we see now on our desktop. The font here that you see in the word Chicago is also part of a series of fonts that were developed that were named after cities. These were also bitmap based in the beginning, so they look very blocky. And this actual font, Chicago, was really the most important of those city fonts designed and had to be finished early on because it was used for the operating system for the Macintosh. April Greiman is recognized as one of the first designers to embrace computer technology as a design tool. As you can see here in her piece, Snow White and the Seven Pixels, from 1986, now in the collection at the MoMA. In 1984, Greiman bought her first Apple Macintosh computer. In her work, she sought to visualize the limitations of new technology and even exploited pixelation. She understood the aesthetic value of technological accidents. Many see the resurgence and rediscovery of wood type and letterpress printing again as a rejection of the growing digital technologies that surround us. With the laptop, the idea of portability blossomed into the iPod, the smartphone, the tablet, and now wireless TV and radio. Hand-drawn typography and wood type have become more and more popular in the last 10 years, at the same time that the digital graphic technology has really surged. The Industrial Revolution was the transition to new manufacturing processes from a period of about 1760 to sometime between 1820 and 1840. During this time, we saw the emergence of arts and crafts movement and the Art Nouveau movement as a direct rejection of the new mechanized industrial processes that were emerging at the time. These movements were born of ideals and grew out of a concern for the effects of industrialization on design, traditional skills, and the lives of ordinary people. The study of typography is central to both the history and practice of graphic design. My continued research at the Hamilton Type Museum allows for a more in-depth understanding of typography overall. In particular, the important role wood type has played in graphic design history and its resurgence with current designers in the last few years. The Hamilton Type Museum has the largest collection of wood type in the country, and a recent move of the museum to a new location involved 27 semi-trucks. The museum currently houses over 1 million pieces of type and hundreds of one-of-a-kind wood type fonts, which is really exciting to me. While at the museum, exploration of shape and form, as well as identification of often unused fonts, is part of an ongoing development for me as a designer. My daily exploration and conceptualization of ideas leads to the production of typographic wood prints. So these are some just early explorations. Here you can see the big red E that's printed is approximately 1 square foot, which means I was working with a square foot letter in composing these prints. So in the beginning, simply learning how to set up the letters backwards on the press to print, using furniture, which are small pieces of wood or sometimes metal of various sizes for spacing on the press, inking the wood letters evenly as they're often over 100 years old and not so even themselves, and working with a hand press that was at least 100 years old was a little bit of a challenge. As I continued the process of handling typographic shapes, though, I began exploring the relationships of both form and content. Working with fonts that have been lost or unseen for decades provided an opportunity to discover and create something unique. This is another early print, an early example from 2009. And here, the large E's that you're looking at that frame the piece are 3 foot tall. This piece was printed on a hand pressure press. It was the first time I had access to this particular press. And this print has approximately 8 to 10 passes through the press for each print. It was a real workout. So my current research involves discovering visual relationships that appear through the combination of overlapping and layering of varying fonts using transparent color. My current series is based upon the alphabet as core shape and seeks to blur the boundary of type and image, instead creating typographic compositions as image. Each letter composition in the series utilizes 3, sometimes more fonts per print, and typographic shapes are overlapped using semi-transparent color palette, resulting in the creation of a totally new way to see a particular letter, focusing the viewer instead on the relationship between the form, color, and content instead of the single letter itself. The nature of the museum and working with this vast collection forces a designer to think on your feet, so to speak. No matter your sketches or ideas ahead of time, once on site, all is dependent upon the availability of a particular font. For instance, you may be working away with a particular typeface when suddenly you realize the D is missing or the J is missing, and suddenly you have to design and improvise on your feet. Variables include not only the possibility of missing letters, but also being able to relocate a font that perhaps you were previously working with even as long as a year ago. This by-hand process also includes the possibility of over-inking or under-inking your letters when printing. Not to mention you're printing and setting up prepress backwards, and then there's the alignment challenge of multiple passes through the press. Each of my letters in the series contains at least 3, sometimes 5 passes through the press. Mixing inks each time to the same transparency and color level was an accidental experiential lesson over the course of 2.5 years. Creating with my hands, not a computer, has always been a very important part of my creative process. All through college and grad school, I painted as well as did design work. I was one of the few in my graduate school class in visual communications at the Art Institute of Chicago that was allowed both a design space and a painting studio. I paint for myself, but my painting instructs my design, and my design instructs my painting, and I find that both suffer without the other. In developing my series, I chose to work with 3 of the 4 process inks, yellow, cyan, and magenta, giving a nod to both the printing process as well as the work of the designer Bradbury Thompson, which you see here. Bradbury Thompson was one of the giants of the 20th century design world, and he states, although the designer works with graphics of past centuries, he must create in the spirit of his own time, showing in his designs an essential understanding rather than a labored copying of past masters. Thompson's work, shown here, is from a series called West Vigo Inspirations from 1956. This was a promotional magazine that Thompson did for the West Vigo Paper Company. As you can see, these images were professionally offset printed, allowing for both transparency and accuracy of color. But my interest lies more in the unexpected shapes and colors that form from the overlapping of transparent inks that can sometimes alter our read of the letter itself. Additionally, adding transparent medium to the inks also altered the color to be a lot lighter than the original cyan, magenta, and yellow process colors, producing a more pastel color palette. The series enabled several learnings, as I had no intention of creating this entire series of work when I began. I just started. I started with the letter A, and then, of course, I was interested, what does B look like? And then, of course, I had to do the C, and then it hit me. I had to complete the entire alphabet. I had to complete the process. I had never experienced doing a body of work this large or over this length of time, 2.5 years, and both provided great challenges. Doing so helped me learn a lot about myself and my creative process. Exploring how letter forms could come together, forming spatial relationships that worked, forming spatial relationships that worked within each individual print, but also worked rhythmically throughout the entire series as a whole, was both exciting and challenging. I've already begun some of the new ideas that came to me while working on this series. Anytime you experience working on a body of work that takes this much time, different ideas and different possibilities come to you in the middle of it. And part of my challenge also was to be disciplined and to stick to my original idea and see it through. And I have to say, over a course of 2.5 years, that was quite a challenge. And it really forces you to learn more about your own process than anyone could ever teach you. I've already begun working on some of the additional ideas that came to me in this series. I couldn't wait when I was done. But with the discovery of this visual knowledge, I've come to a better understanding of my own working processes as a designer. I've also had to rise to the challenge of being able to design on the spot, as I said, when pieces were missing or sketches I did ahead of time wouldn't work out based on what was available at the time. And overall, this work really continues to instruct me, both historically and typographically, about my field. So I encourage you to check it out as well. Thank you. I now would like to introduce you to Ryan Thompson. Ryan is our sculpture professor as well as teaches senior seminar courses here and works in photography as well. Ryan came to us from Calvin, and Ryan has exhibited most recently internationally. We're thrilled to have him here this evening, and he's next.
This is really fun for us. I hope it's fun for you too. It's a privilege to be able to talk about our work, so thanks for being here. I'm going to start right in the middle of everything. A couple years ago, I set up, I needed a new website. The name Ryan Thompson, let's just say there's a lot of Ryan Thompsons out there. So it's partly a branding challenge, and it was partly a question of figuring out a framework for myself. How was I going to kind of frame my actions in the world? As an artist, I have a lot of different interests. I think one of the things that drew me to being an artist was this idea of being a professional amateur, right? I can kind of study and learn about all different kinds of things in the world and apply those to my creative process. And so I was told in graduate school that my work was looking a lot like a natural history museum. So I thought, okay, I do like to represent information. I do like the natural world. I do like thinking about our role in it. And so I started thinking about how to kind of frame that activity, and the Department of Natural History kind of came out of that. So the Department of Natural History is kind of my web address, and now I think about it too as this larger kind of structure where I can say, oh, I've got this new idea for a project. Does it fit in the Department of Natural History or not? Yes, it does. Great. I can take that on. No, it doesn't. I probably don't have time for that. I need to think about, I don't know, collaborating on something else with someone else. But it's a framework as much as it is a kind of branding project for me. I'm like, anyways, like a crow that's attracted to shiny things. It's, you gotta, you can't collect them all. So there's 3 kind of guiding principles for the Department of Natural History. I'm the only person in the Department of Natural History, by the way. It sounds big and grandiose, but it's just me mainly and sometimes a collaborator here and there. So, yeah. So there's 3 kind of guiding principles for the Department of Natural History. Number 1, how can we better understand our place and our time relative to the history of the universe? The universe is a big, long time span, and it's a very big place. So this is kind of a Herculean or a Sisyphean task. It's not one that can be accomplished, I don't think, but it's very worth trying. If we're lucky, we live 100 years, but what is that compared to 10,000, 100,000, 100 million, a few billion, 100 billion, right? The history of the universe, I don't know, but I think it's worth trying to better understand that, trying to better understand what those timescales look like next to each other. So that's a really big part of my practice. Number 2, how do lens-based images function in the world, and how do they change our understanding of it? My background is in lens-based imagery, photos, videos. I take original photos and videos. I borrow original, it's a nice word for stealing. I appropriate, there's an even better word that fits with our art context. And so I'm very interested in how these images function in the world, both from a historical perspective and also from a cultural perspective. So a lot of my work returns to lens-based imagery, oftentimes. And number 3, oops, I'm supposed to be clicking this. How might I make work that engenders transformational thinking? How do those interests influence the way we all think, and how does it change the way I understand the world? How does it change our perception and then our actions in terms of digesting images and in terms of digesting this work? This is most definitely the most difficult part of it, is thinking about that transformation. It's not something that I think you can turn into equation. I think it's something that can happen, and when it happens, it can be kind of transcendent, but you can't make it happen. So you have to kind of set the groundwork and then hope that it can happen once in a while. Okay, that's the context. I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes or so about a series of works that are about rocks. And rocks are kind of boring, but really magical at the same time. And I don't know when exactly I got interested in geology and rocks, but when it hit me, it hit really hard. And for some people, maybe that was as a kid. Maybe you haven't gotten there yet, but look out. It's coming for you. Maybe it'll happen right now. No pressure. And I'm thinking about framing these kind of series of works. First, it was glacial erratics. Oops. Can I make this? What are we on? Oh, it is wiggling. Okay. First, it was glacial erratics, these large boulders that are moved by glaciers in the last ice age, some 10 to 100,000 years ago. Maybe you've seen them at the edge of a cornfield. Maybe you've seen them in the middle of campus. But there's these rocks that we don't know what to do with, and they sit and they sit and they sit and they sit. I decided to photograph them, make them wiggle like this, and then they were displayed on televisions that were becoming obsolete at that time. These big, large object televisions that are CRT tubes that everyone was casting aside because we were in the middle of a analog to digital transition, and we didn't know what to do with these things because we were all getting these slick flat screens, and the TVs were becoming flat and architectural and more like images and less like objects. And so these two things kind of came together really nicely, but that's just the background. So glacial erratics, meteorites, which is what I would like to talk to you mostly about today and what's in the gallery. And then the next kind of phase is petrified wood. I've got this series of projects about petrified wood that's kind of ongoing. So the bigger umbrella is kind of thinking about what does it mean to kind of embody a geological way of understanding the world. So towards a geologic conscience, if I'm sort of thinking about it. There's this essay I'm writing that's got that as kind of the subtitle, Towards a Geologic Conscience. So if we think about our lives relative to this glacial erratic that got moved 50,000 years ago, but that is millions of years old, or about relative to these meteorites that are as old as the Earth or perhaps older, what does that mean? How do we understand that? How do I understand our place in the world? Can that make us better people? I'm skipping around a bit. Carl Sagan, the populist astrophysicist, cosmologist, et cetera, writer, TV personality, popularized the cosmic calendar, which you see here that overlays the history of the universe, some 100 billion years, onto a calendar year, a calendar Earth year. So from January 1st at 12 o'clock a.m. to December 31st at 11:59 and 59 seconds. And on that calendar, you'll notice, occupy the last 60 seconds. Humans occupy the last 60 seconds on the calendar. That kind of blew my mind, and so it also starts to set the context for some of my work. This feels like a ready-made. It's like he made this amazing artwork, and I want to take credit for it, but I can't. I need to play that again with sound, and you'll hear maybe just a little bit of it. Last February, this happened. This is the Chelyabinsk meteorite coming through the stratosphere last February in Russia that blew up when it tried to enter our atmosphere and rained down tens of thousands of pieces. It injured a bunch of people. Nobody died, thankfully, but it blew out windows. It collapsed roofs. It was the biggest meteorite fall in modern history. The next most recent one was also in Russia. I don't know why they're attracted to Russia, but they seem to be. It flattened a huge forest in the 19th century, early 19th century, and this one is kind of a close second. And I was in the midst, I had been making works about kind of meteorites and meteoritics for a couple years, and this happened, and it was like this huge gift. I was glued to these YouTube videos. There's dashboard videos in Russia because there's very poor car insurance, and so everyone records everything they do in the car to kind of prove insurance. And so there's lots of videos of it, which is really great for the meteoritics community. So all these works about meteorites are called the dark flight works, and this refers to a portion of flight in the history of a meteorite between when it's burning and ablating in the stratosphere. As you saw that coming through the atmosphere, it's burning up, it's moving so fast, and it's so big that it's lighting on fire like a space shuttle coming through for re-entry. As soon as that stops, it goes black, and it's called dark flight. And dark flight goes from there to when it hits the ground. And what's really interesting about this portion is that we can't see it. We can't detect it, we can't see it, we don't know where it is, and we can kind of make inferences about that, but there's no way of kind of proving that. And I'm very interested as an artist in the role of perception and this black, dark flight portion that we can't just prove at all. So between the top, which is that meteorite coming through, and the bottom, which is them dragging it out of a lake in the Chelyabinsk region just a couple weeks ago, actually, we don't know what happens. Sometimes they hit cars, like this Peekskill meteorite car in New York in 1992. This bright red Chevy Malibu, which is just, I don't know, just so beautiful to me. It got hit by the rock on the right here. So we have this proof, and we have videos of this one too. It happened on a Friday night. There was lots of Friday night football games going on in New York. And so there were people with VHS cameras filming their kids on the field, and then all of a sudden there's this fireball coming through the sky. Again, just happened to be a nice time for that to happen. And it hit this car. And so we have the video, we have the car, we have the rock, but we don't have the dark flight. And so we're kind of making these inferences and piecing these things together and believing in something and kind of putting our faith in something that is a little shaky, even though we have all the pieces. So I'm interested in those, in that perception, in the lack, in the missing pieces, oftentimes, and that led me, as I'm doing this meteoritics research, to a phenomenon called meteor wrongs. And so, people hunting for meteorites has become very popular. We have cable television shows called The Meteorite Men. We have you and me going out to find meteorites. It's become quite a phenomenon, and with that, we have more and more meteor wrongs. That is, false positives, people finding rocks and saying, this must be a meteorite. It looks so weird. I found this in my backyard, and it looks nothing like the rock that it was sitting next to. It has to be a meteorite. It just has to be. It's not. I'm sorry, it's not. Oh, it could be. It very well could be. But the Arizona Center for Meteorite Studies at the Arizona State University Center for Meteorite Studies has this collection of meteorites that was gifted to them by the grandfather of meteoritics, H.H. Neininger. And within that collection of world-famous meteorites, they have this collection of meteor wrongs. And it's not really cataloged, so it's kind of at the edge of the collection, and I became really interested in that fact that they have this collection of rocks that some of them were meteorites, and they were declassified. Some of them never were meteorites, but people thought they were. And those rocks haven't changed. It's just our perception of them that's changed. And that's really interesting to me, that there's this huge contextual shift, but the physical thing hasn't changed one bit. It's just our understanding of it. And it's the evolution of knowledge, too. Some of these rocks were classified as meteorites. This is a meteorite. It came from outer space. Time goes by. This is not a meteorite. This did not come from outer space. It is coal slag. It is copper. It is whatever. It's not a meteorite, right? So that's really fascinating to me. It points to a humility and a humbleness in a scientific community that I think is really important. And there's something humorous about it. A lot of my work is humorous. It's okay to laugh. Here's some details. I turned those into a poster And then that moved into thinking about more amateur communities looking for rocks and uploading these finds to meteorite identification forums. Hey guys, I found this rock. It must be a meteorite. Can you please tell me that it is? No, I'm sorry, it's not. So I downloaded 300 of these instances, cut them out, and put them in this black night sky. So this is Photoshop, download, cut it out, paste it in. It creates a night sky. So now we have this night sky made up of rocks that never were in the night sky, but we're kind of wishing for them to be as we're wishing upon the night sky. So there's this kind of, it's a little sad, but I think it's also hopeful. I don't know, it's beautiful, and I encourage the search. I don't want it to be something that's sad. I don't want there to be a lack. I want there to be mystery. I want to embrace that process. So here's some details. If you get close to it in the gallery, you can kind of see some details like this. So that's called Dark Flight, Dark Sky. They all kind of have the subtitle of Dark Flight. This is a self-portrait as a Gibeon meteorite. This is a meteorite that was found in 1992 in Namibia by some local tribes people. They dug this out of the desert, and it had these natural holes through the middle of it and looks kind of like a face. So we have this kind of beautiful anthropomorphic rock that we can kind of gaze upon and wonder about the origins of life, as we do with meteorites, look for clues as to the origins of where we all started. And now I'm kind of literally taking it as a mask. It's dubbed the mask meteorite, and I'm now literally kind of using that mask to kind of think about those origins of life through this kind of anthropomorphic rock. Scary, funny, I don't know, both, I think, I hope. And there's a really big version of it in the gallery, too, that you can do something similar with. When that Russian meteorite came through, people really wanted to know how big it was, right? At first, it was a 10-story office building, right, bigger than this building. And then later, they figured out there was maybe more like the size of a school bus. But it was important to journalists, to scientists, to understand its size relative to our physical embodied experience of life on Earth. So we grasp at objects. Oh, it's a grapefruit. Oh, it's the size of a yam. Oh, it's the size of Lambeau Field, right? So we can understand this very abstract thing coming through the stratosphere that we never actually have access to because it's losing material and burning and blowing up as it comes through oftentimes. So both as a way of reaching for something that we can never understand and as a way of, embodying that experience. I made this list, and there's a bookmark in the gallery that you can take with you to think about the way language operates in that way. And last is this microscopic meteorite that is on the tip of my index finger. I wrote an essay about micrometeorites that come through the atmosphere without turning into shooting stars, that land all around us, that end up in our coffee cups, that get in our hair, et cetera, as a way of kind of understanding that outer space isn't just out there, right? It's a part of our everyday world. And then that photo was used on this book cover, back of this book cover, which was really exciting with the essay. So thank you.